The RPG Cave's mana is fueled by patrons over at patreon.com/YumiCapri, and I want to say thanks to each and every one of our Patreon supporters for all of your support throughout the years, as well as supporting our independent content. And let's start by thanking our premium producers, Dallas Ford, Lee Navarro, the fearless leader of the Phoenix Overdrive Extra Life team, and Jonathan Brown. You can find his content over at youtube.com/PMEntertainment. Our platinum producers, Robbie Bobby Mailer and Trucker Sloth. And our gold members, Argo, Brendan Myers, Dallas Robbins, Emily O'Kelly, Heather Boney, James Johnson, Joel Brooks, Jose Jimenez, Mac Time, Benji Kong, Marcus O'Neill, RJ Kern, Dano, Skinny Matt, Mr. and Mrs. Nasty Boots, Foolish Fuji, and Xavier Reyes. Thank you all for all of your support. Now, let's clear these dungeons of some mobs. Greetings, fellow travelers, and welcome to the 13th level of the RPG Cave. I'm one of your hosts, the level 989 human archmage, Ryan Turford, and I'm joined, as always, by the level 99 elf ranger, Mr. Garret Bland. Garret, how are you doing on this lovely, lovely Saturday that hasn't been full of problems or anything like that?
No, not at all. I've been having an okay morning, and a chill morning at that. I watched the latest episode of Ted Lasso, and just chilling, you know? But over on your end, you got some technical difficulties going on, and I'm sorry about that.
I know, between the fact that you currently can't see me, to the point that where this might not have been the first time we've recorded this intro, to a whole bunch of stuff. I mean, that's what happens when you buy a new computer, because I just bought a new computer this week. It's very fancy, but it does not currently want to work. So we're currently on our old school setup, and not even everything there is working. But that's enough behind the curtain. Let's clear the dungeon of some pesky mobs. Of course, if you like what we do and you want to support the show, of course, there's a number of ways you can do that. Number one, you can support us on your podcast service of choice. You can leave us a review on Apple Podcasts, but as well, you can subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts, Google Play, Spotify. We're on all the things. Also, if you want to see our beautiful faces this week, I laugh a little bit because you didn't see my face last week. Go back and watch the Final Fantasy VII episode if you want to see why my face wasn't there. Of course, though, youtube.com/YumiCapri is how you go about doing that. You can like, subscribe, share with all your friends, all the stuff that, again, YouTubers tell you to do when you go to YouTube. Last but not least, of course, if you want early access to this show as well as exclusive content, you're going to head on over to patreon.com/YumiCapri. We have early access to all of our shows. Well, it's a little bit early. It's about a day early, as well as exclusive shows like the Pants Patreon podcast for patrons podcast, as well as the Yumi and Capri show. So there you go. Those are all the things that people can do to support us. But Garret, let us read from the secret text, and we're definitely reading from the sacred text this week. We're going old school this week. I'm ready to give both the listeners and Garret a history lesson.
You're going to give me a lecture, man.
This week. It's fine. I prepared a presentation slideshow using,
Really?
No, please. I didn't go
Professor
that far.
Turford going on over here.
No, I'm not going that far. But, of course, I wanted to talk about something kind of near and dear to my heart. And that's working designs. So we had actually talked about the idea of doing like an episode devoted to a specific company kind of off air when we were kind of like coming up with ideas for what companies maybe you want to talk about. And I mean, we could have done for the very first episode like this, we could have done some of the obvious ones, like Square Enix or any other, major RPG company. But the reason I actually wanted us to do working designs is because this actually kind of brings us back to kind of the origins of Japanese localization in North America. I mean, first of all, working designs weren't the very first company to actually do, North American localization of Japanese video games. But they were really the first to really have like their brand kind of be associated as like the stamp of quality for Japanese releases coming to North America. I mean, for the most part, if you played older NES RPGs or even a lot of Super Nintendo and Genesis RPGs, a lot of them are full of like translation issues or you can definitely tell either they rushed through it or they basically took like the literal interpretation of what the Japanese text said and just pasted it as is, which of course, if anyone knows anything about the Japanese language, it doesn't work that way. Like you can't do just a one-to-one comparison between that and English because they don't line up correctly. They're not just different. They don't just use different letters and arrangements of letters, but also the sentence structure is like completely different from, North American English sentence structure. So it really kind of forced developers to really thinking about how to basically bring these products to North America, and basically Working Designs was at the kind of the forefront of this. So of course, as we always do, we're going to go to quick facts, although these are going to be a little more wordy and lengthy than usual quick facts because, I mean, for the most part, we're doing a company. Anytime we're doing a company, for the most part, I expect we're going to probably have a long list of facts to kind of go along with that. So first off, Working Designs has released over 30 games during its lifetime, which is pretty impressive because they actually closed down in 2005, which we'll get to in a little bit. So, I mean, between 1993 and 2006, they released 30 games, which is pretty impressive. So that's more than one game a year for sure, or maybe like a couple games. Yeah, for sure. And it wasn't just publishing that they did. Again, you have to remember they also did all the localization for these games, recording vocals and stuff like that too. So it's actually a lot more work than just slapping their name on it and then making sure it goes to distributors, like some publishers end up doing. The studio itself was originally formed though in 1986. By Todd Mark and venture capitalist Sylvia Schmidt with the intent on making accounting software for IBM PCs, and they're stationed in Redding, California, which is just, it's funny to think about because they had no intention of actually making games. But what happened was in 1988, Todd Mark, who was actually the head of the company, passed away, and it actually the company basically fell to lead programmer Victor Ireland to basically take the reins as kind of the company lead and kind of take over the direction for Working Designs. And I mean, for the most part, they had some contracts they had to fill of like basically fulfilling a lot of promises for a lot of accounting software that they had already kind of promised to different companies. But in 1990, they were finally able to kind of shift focus and go from there. And Victor Ireland had like a huge passion for games. Like he really wanted to make games. Apparently that was the reason he got into programming, was he wanted to make games. So when he finally got the chance to, choose what direction the company went in, they decided to actually go down the game route. So, but they were going to continue to work on publishing games rather than making games themselves in a lot of ways. Smart. However, what they started to realize was when they were starting to look for, publishers to work with, most of them had either went through Sega or Nintendo directly, or for the most part, they self-published. So for the most part, it was really hard for them to kind of find developers until they were approached by Taito in June 1991 to kind of sign their very first publishing deal for multiple Taito games, including Parasol Stars and Kadash, which were both PC Engine games in Japan, but actually became TurboGrafx 16 games. And they basically became the fourth third-party publisher for the TurboGrafx 16 in North America, which is just crazy to think about. Like, they were one of the first kind of companies on board outside of Konami to work on TurboGrafx games in North America, which, of course, for folks that don't remember TurboGrafx 16, of course, it was a Konami-published console that just in the West did not get a lot of traction. They had games on Hue cards, which kind of look like, debit or credit cards today.
That's kind of cool.
Which is really interesting. And if you want to collect TurboGrafx 16 games right now, like, they're stupidly expensive. Like, it's such a rare console, especially for like the North American releases of games. It's just, like, some of them are like some of the cheaper ones are like $500 for a game, just for a cartridge only. So they can be pretty expensive. But one of the things that was kind of starting to happen around this time was companies were finally starting to learn about kind of CD-ROM technology, because this was something that, for the most part, was very new to both gaming and PCs at the time, because for the it didn't really kind of become prominent until like 1995 at the earliest. So with that in mind, in 1992, Working Designs actually created their own studio to design specifically to re-record audio for CD-ROM games, and they became the very first third-party publisher of CD-ROM titles in North America for consoles, period. Like, there was no one else doing CD-ROM games in North America at the time, besides Sega. That was really the only other company, and as well as Konami with TurboGrafx, because TurboGrafx did eventually get a CD add-on that allowed you to play CD games as well. That's where we got games like Castlevania Rondo of Blood, for example, or Symphony of the Night. That's where those games really came from. So it was really like a big emerging thing, and they kind of kicked off the craze of CD stuff. With the move to CD, Working Designs becomes an official Sega CD publisher in 1993, and they officially started publishing for Sega Saturn in 1994, which was around when that console was coming out. And again, they were one of the very first kind of publisher of Japanese games on Sega Saturn and Sega CD, which is kind of crazy too. And then in 1995, Working Designs officially became a PlayStation third-party publisher, but it would take a while before we would see a release on the PlayStation, as PlayStation, for folks that don't remember or didn't know, I actually just learned this while doing the research for this, PlayStation was very slow to adopt RPGs for their platform, because they didn't want RPGs for some reason. It actually, like, it took till basically the end of 1996 for us to finally see RPGs on the PlayStation, which is just funny to think about, because if you look back on the PlayStation 1 library, just so much of that library that people remember of it are RPGs. So it's just it's funny to think that Sony just didn't want, RPGs on their consoles. So they made tons of games for PlayStation 1 as well as PlayStation 2, and they basically closed their doors on December 12th, 2005, after running into a bunch of financial complications that were related to issues acquiring approval for some of their unannounced PS2 titles. So they were working on localizing a bunch of PS2 titles, but unfortunately they just couldn't get there were some snags in some of the approvals for some of them, so they never ended up getting released, and they basically just ran out of money, so they actually ended up closing their doors then. However, Working Designs actually continued to live on beyond that point. So Victor Ireland, after the company kind of shuttered, he actually was able to found a new company in July 2006, which was only like 6 months later, essentially, called Gaijin Works. And they actually continued to do the localizing thing that Working Designs was kind of known for as well. So they actually were in talks to basically localize and publish JRPGs on the Xbox 360, but for whatever reason, the deal never actually came to fruition. Because originally, if you remember the 360 launch, there was a big push from Microsoft to have RPGs from Japan on the console, because that was one of the things they were heavily criticized for with the original Xbox. And unfortunately, that fell through, because when this deal was kind of coming about, that was when Microsoft was starting to get out of that focus, because that was after Blue Dragon and Lost Odyssey had come out, and they weren't seeing huge returns from them, so they ended up moving away from that kind of big push, especially because they couldn't move the 360 in Japan even if they wanted to give it away for free at this
that's
point.
very true.
So Gaijin Works ended up publishing games on Nintendo 3DS and WiiWare, as well as they handled a lot of the PS1 PSN ports for PS3 from a bunch of Working Designs titles, as well as some other titles as well. And their final game to date was 2017's Summon Night 6 Lost Borders on PlayStation 4 and Vita. So that was the last game that they put out. They haven't technically announced that they're closed, but they haven't released anything in 4 years, or announced anything or tweeted anything in 4 years. So it's been a long time. So some notable releases, of course, before we kind of get into kind of the discussion about Working Designs. Some of their notable releases include both Lunar, the Silver Star, and Eternal Blue, which will get their own episode later on. I'll talk about those more in depth on a later episode. Pop Full Mail, which was on Sega CD, as well as Vey. The Art the Lad series, which was on PlayStation 1, as well as Elemental Gearbolt. Magic Knight Rayarth, which was based off an anime, but was a really fantastic Sega Saturn game. Like, that was probably one of the Saturn's best games, as well as Shining Wisdom, which was the last Shining Force game before Camelot officially moved over to working with just Nintendo. which is kind of crazy because. The Shining Force series was originally developed by Camelot before Nintendo basically purchased them. So that's kind of all of my quick facts that I kind of had here. So what makes working design so important, and why do I think that they are really an important cog to kind of the wheel that turns that is, JRPGs? So first off, as I kind of alluded to, because they were the first people kind of working with CD technology, that also meant that a lot of games were really starting to go through and do voiceovers, because we didn't really have voices in video games, and that was really something you had to think about until the CD era essentially happened, where you had live action video games, like stuff like Night Trap, where it's just you're basically watching an interactive movie. But also you had like JRPGs that basically had voiceovers with some of the characters while you played it, as well as, in-game cutscenes that eventually led to some of the bigger cutscenes that we see in games like, Final Fantasy VII that we talked about last week. Like that was kind of the thing that kind of inspired that type of thing to happen, was kind of this early CD era. So especially around this time too, because we really didn't have a lot of Japanese voiceover work that was done here in North America, because this was before anime really became a huge popular thing here in North America. Some of the earlier anime dub studios were like Manga Entertainment or the Ocean Group, and out of Canada, and those didn't really come into prominence until like the late 90s. So this company was kind of very much ahead of its time, because it essentially worked like almost like an anime dubbing studio kind of works out, like almost like something like Funimation, but instead of doing anime, they did the same thing that kind of Funimation does for anime, but for games. So this was actually like a really important step for a company in North America to really take, to show kind of the model for how localization should be handled in North America, as well as, kind of the processing quality people really expect from that. Because again, as I mentioned before, like if you go play a game like Ghost Lion, which is an RPG on the NES, like there's all kinds of crazy spelling errors in it, and like the story doesn't make any sense, and it's just weird and goofy. So it's just it's really interesting to kind of look at how much of an impact they really had on the industry, especially too because, as I mentioned, they were kind of known for like the badge of quality, because all their voice work, if you go listen to it now, it's a bit silly and kind of campy. Just like if you go back and watch like a late 90s dubbed anime, for example, there's a little bit of quirkiness to it too. Like if you go rewatch like the dub of like Neon Genesis Evangelion or Cowboy Bebop or something like that, I love Cowboy Bebop. Me too, but like even besides the main characters in Cowboy Bebop, like some of the off characters, like some of them sound off or weird, especially if you go watch it. Yeah, if you watch the dub. So we saw a lot of that from games. So I think that they really showed quality there. Not only that, but they also revolutionized something that I know one Donnie Reese would probably actually appreciate. They were the very first company to introduce collector's editions for games, because at least for consoles, because PCs had kind of done that in the PC space, but we had never really seen a North American publisher do collector's editions for games at all. So the very first one that actually came out was Lunar: The Silver Star Complete, which was on PlayStation 1, that I alluded to a little bit earlier, where it basically came with the game on multiple discs, but then it also came with a making of CD video. So you put the CD into your PlayStation and it plays like a CD video, which was like an old format in Japan. It looks interesting. It looks terrible today. Like it's like worse than VHS quality, but it exists, as well as a soundtrack, an art book, as well as like a cloth map. And instead of it being like a separate purchase, it was the default SKU for the game essentially. So it was actually harder to find the version that released later that was just the base game without the extra stuff than it is to actually find the collector's edition nowadays, which is interesting. Which is just hilarious to think about when you kind of look back on it. And they did that for all their games. Not only that, but even some of their early releases on Sega CD, they would throw in a bunch of different stuff, or they would have like really like intricate and well done manuals with lots of great like illustrations of all the characters and stuff like that. So everything from the packaging to the design to the English translation, like everything about their games just like felt quality. Like you could definitely feel, how impressive it was. So anytime you saw the little working designs label on like a package, you knew this is a game I should be paying attention to at the time.
Okay.
And they were actually
awesome.
And they were actually pretty much able to kind of, maintain that throughout their entire lifetime. So that's why I thought they were really interesting to talk about, because I think their legacy can really be felt today with, all the different localizations we've seen of games since then, because it really changed a lot of companies in the industry and made them kind of pay attention to this. Like that's the reason why, for example, Final Fantasy VII, for example, had as good of a localization as it ended up being, even though there's still some weirdness to it. For the most part, companies like Square Enix and Nintendo really started paying attention to this. There like working designs in a way is like kind of the reason there's a localization department at Nintendo that really handles all this stuff. Because essentially localization, for those that don't know, it's not just about like re-recording the words. It's also basically like rewriting all of the dialogue in the game, especially in an RPG, which heavy on dialogue for the most part, and then putting it all back together in a way that kind of actually makes sense to North American ears, which takes a lot of work. It's not an easy process. It's part of the reason why, like, if a game gets heavily localization like this, like Working Designs games, for example, would come out like sometimes like 2 years after the Japanese release of the games, because it would take so long for them to do the process between re-recording all the vocals for the game, and then rewriting the story and then putting it all into the game itself, as well as sometimes adding some exclusive features to some of the North American versions of the game. Like I know Lunar, that I just talked about on PlayStation 1, they added North American specific features like the ability to use like the DualShock controller, for example, or some other smaller features like that. So they would throw in a lot of extra features in some of their games to help kind of give the North American kind of like a market like some preferential treatment, I guess, which was really interesting. So yeah, I think that their legacy is kind of long felt kind of over the course of the years with RPGs, and they're probably the people to thank for companies like NIS America, who I think is really good, does a really good job with localization nowadays, as well as again the first party companies, or even the main RPG makers like Square Enix, kind of taking localization very seriously and bringing games together. But I'm gonna quickly sip my water, Garrett. But do you have any questions about working designs, or what do you think about this giant diatribe that I've kind of gone on about?
You just taught me, or just filled a gap in gaming history I had no idea about. Like,
you were 3 at the time, so you were very young.
Very true, but like they worked throughout, when I was alive, and I'm looking at the games that they published and everything, and of course I didn't touch any of these games, so yeah, I probably would never hear of this company. But it's really cool to see how this company started that concept of localization, especially with Japanese games. And I guess, now they're not as relevant just because all the first party companies are like, oh, this is the set example and model. We'll just do it in-house. We'll do it in source. And as you said, it takes a lot of work to do this localization. And I really do appreciate all the first party games, especially RPGs, that do voice acting, do the dialogue transfer over. And like, it's actually so surprising now that the gap between the release of Japanese games and English games are so close together than they've ever been before. So yeah, thank you, Working Designs, very much. I'm sorry I didn't know about you at all.
Well, it also helped too that they really published, like a lot of the games they published also were just classic, really solid top tier titles that were kind of like published from smaller Japanese companies, like games that you wouldn't think about. Like, for example, Game Arts, who did the Grandia series, like they published, Lunar, the series came from them. You've also got just a lot of other smaller studios that was kind of their big focus, which again, they remind me so much of NIS America when you actually do kind of the comparisons, or a company like Xseed, which is another one that is kind of like this too, because Xseed does like the Ease games as well as some other RPG localization nowadays too.
That's true. So I don't know how they transitioned from being a county software company to being a publisher. Is that like... I'm just trying to wrap in my head, like, the concept and the talents of just doing software development for accounting, And then, okay, no, let's just do localization of Japanese games. They must have had a hard pivot back in the early 90s to do that.
What it really came down to, the reason they went to kind of localizing Japanese games, it simply like those were the contracts that they had available to them. So they were kind of forced in that position. It wasn't that they had like a big kind of love. I mean, I think from what I've kind of read about the founder anyways, or Victor Ireland in particular, I think he had a passion for Japanese games, but he wasn't like out to basically try and fix this problem. It just so happened like the companies that really needed a publisher in North America were the ones that came from Japan, like smaller companies from Japan, like Taito, or Game Arts, that needed someone to kind of give them that extra push, so people would be able to see their games. And I think that's where that really came from. It's not so much that they were trying to do that, but it's something they fell into, but it's something that they excelled at. Like, but yeah, it's such a crazy story when you think about it too, because to your point, like, it's so weird to go from a counting company to that. But it kind of reminds me of the story of BioWare too, where like BioWare was designed to like set up specifically to do like medical software, and because like the two founders were doctors, and then they somehow ended up doing like Western RPGs and ended up being one of the best Western RPG studios out there. We'll talk about BioWare on another show, but I think that it's interesting in the kind of the same sort of way too, where it's like it's such a weird story, but I loved Working Designs games. It's a big it's a big reason why, like, when I look back on some of my older consoles, one of the ones that I look most fondly on is the Sega CD, which I know really surprises people, because when most people think Sega CD games, they don't think about RPGs. They think about Night Trap and Ground Zero Texas and Mad Dog McCree and like all these really dumb like full motion video games. But Sega CD was like the first console that I had that was like CD based, with voices and full cutscenes and stuff like that. Like it was a really interesting time to be into games, and I still think a lot of those games still really hold up today. They're still really fun. Of course most of the games they publish are still like really beautiful to play today. The voiceover work, even though it still has its problems, it's still pretty dang cool to actually be able to play a game like that and have voices, and they sound pretty good. So yeah, I think that it was a really special time for me to really be getting into games. And again, this is going back to our very first episode where I talked about how I got into RPGs. I mean, it's thanks to Working Designs bringing over the Lunar series in particular that really formed me into an RPG gamer. Like, it's thanks to them that I'm even in RPGs, even talk to you on this podcast about RPGs right now. So yeah, I thought that was really cool to talk about as well. And plus, they don't get enough credit too for some of the Sega Saturn stuff they did too, because Sega Saturn support in North America in particular was really awful. Like, Sega Saturn had some really good games, but the problem was 9 times out of 10 they would choose not to release the games in North America because Sega didn't want to publish it here. Like, they didn't want to go through the effort of porting it to North America. And then Working Designs took on some of the better RPG titles, and they had a lot of really good releases on the Saturn, and we got some other good gems on the Saturn outside of that. But for the most part, most people who collect Saturn nowadays know, like, you pretty much just got to buy Japanese imports of all the games now, because that's the only way you can play them, and half the time you can't read them anyways. Like Police Knots, for example, which is a really fantastic anime ass game about like robot mech police officers in the future, but it's very story heavy. No one ever ended up doing the localization for it. So, yeah, there you go. So that's everything I wanted to talk about with Working Designs. I think they were, again, like a really important part of the RPG, lineage. And I think this was kind of a good way to kind of start off our kind of discussions about, other RPG studios. Even though this one was a little bit shorter, because I know, Garret, this is this is more of a history lesson for you, but at the same time, I know in the future we're going to talk more in depth about some other companies, so looking out for more of those in the future. But
sounds good. Hold on, I have just a couple of questions for you.
Yeah,
I'm just looking down the list. I have a bunch of ROMs just in my Retroid pocket, and I see some of these games. I've loaded it with a lot of Sega Saturn, Sega CD games. Other than Lunar games that you mentioned, what other standout games from this list I should pay attention to?
So I kind of brought these up in kind of the notable releases section, but I would say Popful Mail in particular is actually a really good side-scrolling action RPG. It kind of reminded me of like a side-scrolling platforming version of Zelda in a lot of ways, but it has but it's like a very like cartoonishy game, very comical game where it doesn't take itself seriously. In fact, Garrett, I know you like anime. Have you ever heard of the show The Slayers at all?
No, I haven't actually.
Okay,
no.
So The Slayers is like this like comedic fantasy anime, and it came out in like the late 90s. It's on Funimation, in case anyone actually wants to go watch it. Really good show, but the tone of that show is really what Popful Mail actually really reminded me of. So that's what I wanted to bring up. Plus, it was originally a Super Nintendo game, but the Sega CD version, they added a whole bunch of cutscenes and stuff like that. So that's what I'd say to check out. Otherwise, I would say the better releases are some of the Sega Saturn games, like Magic Knight Rayearth, which is an incredible another action RPG, like an incredible action RPG. Again, based off another anime of the same name, Magic Knight Rayearth, which is on Amazon Prime. If you want to go watch that one. And then Shining Wisdom, I think, is a really good like top-down action RPG, very similar to, again, something like Zelda, but you're doing more kind of dungeon crawls, like and less about kind of unlocking new equipment. So those are the ones I would say to pay attention to. The Ark the Lad games on PlayStation 1 are also pretty solid, but I don't think they've held up as well because just for the nature of PlayStation 1 games, that they just don't age super well. Case in point, when we talked about Final Fantasy VII last week. So
it's like, oof.
Yeah. Some of the graphics for those games aren't great, but I think they were fun games in their day. So those are the ones I would say to look out for, and of course, Lunar, but you said not to say that one, so I didn't.
Because I know. Definitely get into that. Cool. Well, thank you for that history lesson, man. I'm definitely just like inspired and like thank you for just filling out that gap in history that I just had no idea about with working designs.
Yeah, for sure. All right, now you just got to go load up on Sega CD games, Garrett. One day I'm going to turn you into a Sega CD person, Garrett. It's going to be great. All right, let's party up because we've got a couple questions this week, Garrett, and we received lots of time for them this week. We're going to start with Delroy at JDelroyC, and he asks, have you ever played, for some reason he put played in quotations, a single-player RPG with someone else, passing the controller, sharing a save, or simply watching along? When I was younger, my not-a-gamer sister and I would play through RPGs like Suikoden II and Lunar together. Shout out to Delroy for the Lunar reference, of course. Her reading the text aloud and me playing. It was an amazing bonding experience and one I shall recall fondly. RPGs were one of the few genres that allowed us with this type of engagement that can be incredibly rewarding for people who don't traditionally enjoy games or aren't actively playing. So I don't know if you have an answer to this one, Garrett, but I'll go first with this one because I have a couple stories. So first off, growing up, I of course have two brothers. I have an older brother, Kyle, and my younger brother, Corey, but we're like not separated by too many years. Like my older brother Kyle is like, we're like a year and a half apart essentially. So a lot of times what would end up happening is like my mom and dad, if they bought us video games when we were younger, they would actually buy games for both of us to kind of share. And a lot of times when we were finally getting into RPGs, Lunar was actually the game that Kyle actually ended up getting for his birthday one year. And we actually, like, when Kyle started playing it, I was really kind of sitting along with him and kind of watching through the experience. And we kind of experienced it together. And we did that for a lot of games. Not necessarily RPGs, mainly because, again, like a lot of our childhood, we weren't really playing too many RPGs. And it wasn't really until, and after that, in kind of our teenage years, Kyle was more kind of into music and, playing in a band and stuff like that. And I was still playing lots of video games, but I was also playing a lot of PC games at the time. And then by the time I was more into console RPGs, it was only a year or two before he kind of graduated and moved off. So we didn't really play too much together, but we did have a couple experiences like playing Lunar, just like Delroy and his sister did. We had that experience. Cool. Otherwise, I mean, I've been in relationships with girls that haven't really been traditional gamers, and they've usually liked to watch along with some of the games I'm playing. And to Delroy's point, like it's a really cool bonding experience and just, fun to, talk about the game together and kind of have just kind of the one person kind of experience the story together, which I think is really interesting. And I kind of missed that because I used to do that all the time, whether it was, with in past relationships or when I was living with my roommate from a few years ago. We did a lot of stuff like that too. So yeah, I think it's pretty fun, to Delroy's point, to kind of share a game together and kind of experience it for the story. But Garrett, what do you think about this question? Did you do anything like this yourself, or what do you think?
So when I was growing up, I actually was the only child throughout like most of my childhood. So I did not have a brother or sister close in age where I could share a long meaty game like an RPG day in, day out to like experience with. So I did not personally have a huge memory of that. I did have friends come over and like have sleepovers quite a bit. But it was mainly playing those party games and just playing that together, because RPGs, they take a while, right? Yeah. They would, it's not a single night. It's like, probably for kids, with restrictions and everything, maybe a month-long process, maybe more than that. So I normally just played stuff like Star Fox and Mario Kart and like Halo, all like the couch co-op games. It would be better to play that together. I remember some of my friends bringing over new games though, like Assassin's Creed 1 and like BioShock, the stuff like that. And I remember them playing it in my house, but they didn't want to share the controller at all. Yeah. Every time that they brought the game over, it's for them to play, not for me to play. And so it was actually kind of just a weird thing. And I would just play Pokemon on my handheld or whatever while they just play their game on the screen. And then my parents would come over. It's like, why are you guys sleeping over if you're just going to play separate games? Or just go outside, go to the pool or something. So yeah, I personally didn't have a childhood experience like that. That I traded off an RPG. Like when I was in college, I had one roommate. He was a huge gamer as well. We would like share a bunch of like just gaming knowledge together. And then eventually we played a lot of Borderlands 2 together. So that's one thing that we shared with. And then we still play games to this day, just like different online multiplayer games. Mm-hmm. But yeah, other than that, I didn't have personally a single player RPG that I traded off with someone. Mm-hmm. Actually, one memory of that, not an RPG, but Super Smash Brothers. Okay. The event matches. Mm-hmm. I would trade it off with my friend to defeat the event matches in one go. And we eventually got all 51 event matches in Melee. So that's my like only experience trading a controller, in a sense, for to share a game experience together. And
I think it's just a generational thing too, that might play into that a little bit, because again, when I was growing up, things were very different. We didn't have a lot of co-op games, or if they were co-op games, it was like the Mario style co-op from the original Mario games, where essentially one person plays, and when they die, the next person picks up for wherever they were playing from, and then going from there, and you kind of go back and forth to see maybe who beats the game first in a way. So we didn't really have like a lot of co-op stuff. So it was more likely, that if we had a story-based game, like, and I was watching like someone else play it, like I would be probably start to get invested in it and stuff like that too. Mm-hmm. So yeah, I think that's where a lot of that comes from. It's just me being old, Garrett. Being old man, like I look at games a little bit differently like that. So whereas nowadays, if I grew up kind of in this era you did, like it would make more sense to me play more like couch co-op games, because we saw so much of that during either the N64 era or the GameCube, Xbox era, because all those consoles came with 4 controller slots for a reason, so you can all play together. Yeah. Whereas it was not like that back then. So
that's true.
There you go. Next question comes to us from Discord, from the Winter Gamer, and he asks, I just upgraded to an Xbox Series S. What RPG would you suggest one should try through Game Pass that would definitely use the benefit of the faster console? So to give you time to think, Garrett, I have a couple that I came up with. Because obviously, I think you answered this a little bit when he answered this on Discord. But I know you didn't give it like a specific example, because he didn't, because it was just like, how many of RPGs are really going to take advantage of the speed boost? But there were 2 that I thought of. One that actually stands out very quickly is the Outer Worlds because the Outer Worlds is like a first-person RPG that has so long load times on the original console. Like if you go to a new area, sometimes it takes up to a minute to load on like the original Xbox, like on Xbox One. Whereas if you play it on Series S, it's not instant, but it's pretty fast. Just the downside to that version in particular is that there was an upgrade patch that came for the Outer Worlds, but it only came to Series X, not Series S.
Wow.
So I
didn't know that.
It doesn't benefit for a lot of those, but just from the raw horsepower of the SSD, it just loads faster just by default without them actually tinkering with it. So that was one that I came up with, and the other one was Dragon Quest XI, which I don't think necessarily had super long load times on Xbox One, but I do think that the One S actually does a nice job of really taking advantage of the power within that console and actually providing you a better experience with the load times in that game. But those are the two I came up with. Garrett, what about you? What do you think about this question?
So a few games that popped in my head. I was thinking about this. I remember playing. I played Skyrim 360, One X, Series X, like throughout the whole generations of Xboxes, and the evolution of just that game in terms of just the remastered graphics, FPS boost, and then now with the SSD. Let me tell you, the load times in Skyrim, you can't read the subtitles anymore. That's actually was part of the entertainment of Skyrim is seeing the nice little loading times with the figurines
between
and then the little text at the bottom.
It just sitting there
spinning the figurine.
Yeah.
Oh man, I spin that figurine for at least 2 to 3 minutes on my 360. It was pretty fun actually. But now you can't see it. It's just like half a second. It's like boom, boom, you're there.
Yep.
And it's fast and it's ready to go. And it's so nice to have that kind of experience with Skyrim.
Yeah.
It's just you're on the go and it's just super instant load times. So I would recommend wholeheartedly Skyrim. And also Yakuza Like a Dragon.
Ooh, that's a good one.
That game, oh my goodness. I got that day one and I'm glad I did. It's such a great game. But the load times on there is just non-existent. It's just like, here's a loading screen, like 0.1 second, and then you're instantly in. Like there's just no waiting time at all. So those are the two games I really recommend. A non-RPG that I would actually go back to is probably Dishonored 1. Dishonored 1 is notorious for their loading times on the 360. Now, with FPS boost and with the loading times, a completely different experience. So yeah, there are definitely a few games on Game Pass that the hardware Series S and Series X take full advantage of, and it's awesome.
Those are some good picks. In fact, I would say even you could go back to like Fallout 3 or Fallout New Vegas if you're going to replay those too, because I remember those having pretty long load times too, and I'm sure they're probably instant as well. I haven't played them again on the console, but I'm sure that they would take advantage of that as well. So, we had some good picks. I mean, there's not a ton of RPGs on, Series X on Game Pass in particular. I was tempted to say Octopath Traveler, but I was like, it doesn't really take advantage of the fast speed because it was already a fast loading.
It really doesn't.
And same with like something like Crest Tales or some of the indie RPGs and stuff too, kind of are in the same boat. And then last question this week comes to us from Gilgamesh, and this is a bit of a read, so stick with me on this one, folks. I was introduced to The Witcher through the Leshen crossover event with Monster Hunter World, and it is without question one of my favorite fights in that game. The music just fits so well, and the fight was fantastic. General RPG question. Since I missed the Monster Hunter episode, I don't know if this should go in the Witcher /crossover /boss fights video, but what unique boss fights from any RPG or non-RPG franchise would you like to see crossover into another RPG franchise? Bonus points if they have their own music that just fits. My personal pick would be the Secret of Mana Dark Lich boss crossed over in Dark Souls 3. That would be pretty awesome because the Dark Lich boss, of course, is just this, evil entity, and it just probably would fit in with kind of Dark Souls. And even like another good example of this as well, and just going back to your Monster Hunter example, Gilgamesh, was the Final Fantasy XIV crossover event with Monster Hunter, because they actually ended up doing a trial, which is essentially like a mini raid boss fight that you do, but with Rathlos. And essentially, you actually fight Rathalos, and he has a bunch of different mechanics, and it has its own like unique Monster Hunter music that goes along with it. Not only that, but there's unique monster mechanics in the fight, such as the ability to bring like a mega potion with you. That essentially at a certain point during the fight, like the healers can't heal anyone anymore, and you're basically relying on using your mega potion to keep yourself from dying to Rathalos. So I thought that was really interesting. Plus, you can unlock a Rathalos mat, Garrett, which who doesn't want to ride around on a Rathalos in Final Fantasy XIV? Like, come on, please. So
that would be legit.
Yeah. As far though, when I read this question, honestly, there weren't too many that came to mind. I mean, to kind of steal your example, Gilgamesh, like I would maybe take like the Grim Reaper boss from Castlevania and put it into Dark Souls, like any of the Souls games. I think it would kind of fit. But I think it's a little bit tougher to to kind of bring over a boss fight from a previous game and kind of put it into a game universe that it doesn't really exist in, and kind of have it like feel like it organically fits anyways. So I'm having trouble to think about an answer for this one. But what about you, Garrett? Do you have an answer in mind for this one?
Yeah, I mean, I just have like a couple of thoughts about it. First off, like these crossover events, I mean, they are for franchises that they're really open to crossover events like Final Fantasy XIV, and Monster Hunter is now just very notable to cross over to so many different franchises, like with Horizon Zero Dawn and Witcher. And what I would like to see is just the other way around. I understand it doesn't fit with like Horizon Zero Dawn or Witcher. I get that. But like they could still make some amount of effort to bring in some monsters from Monster Hunter into those games. And like it would be really cool to see. Maybe not Horizon Zero Dawn, but definitely Witcher 3. I would love to be Geralt and try to face Rathalos or Diablo. Cool. That would be very cool to see, and especially with that combat and that like the atmosphere with it. And I would love to try to take it down. I think it's a really cool thing to do to kind of just advertise your game to other fans of like a similar genre. So it's a really cool thing. Another thought about this, and I don't know why they didn't do this, but I guess they just don't have time or effort. The Octopath Traveler people, like, is it Tokyo RPG Factory or is it a different one?
Different
I'm
one.
sorry.
Tokyo RPG Factory was I Am Setsuna and Ononaki.
Right. So, but the Path Traveler people, why not bring in classic 2D Final Fantasy bosses in there as just like some simple boss rushes? Like it doesn't even need to be fit into the story or whatever, but just like, hey, here's an opening over here. Oh, here's like a crossover event with Final Fantasy 3 bosses over here, or Final Fantasy 5 over here. I think that would be really cool to just like refresh or regurgitate that old Final Fantasy lore and just like make everyone knows, hey, these intricate bosses do exist, and let's just put them into like the new 2D games and see how they fare. So I think that would be a pretty cool idea to do. But I understand they're probably hard to work that Project Triangle Strategy. Yep. And they're almost ready to go with that one. I can't wait
Sean's
for that.
favorite game of all time.
Ready. Yeah. Exactly. It's the go for both of us. I can't wait.
And actually, like while you were talking, I thought of it as like, you know what, one boss I would love to see like either in a Final Fantasy game or another Square Enix game, maybe even Octopath Traveler is Lavos. Like having like Lavos be like a boss fight in like another game, because Lavos goes across time and dimensions and stuff like that. So it would make like canonical sense for him to be like
that would be perfect
in another game and maybe do some crossovers with some Chrono franchise stuff, because come on, Square, like why haven't you done anything with that yet? So yeah, I think that was one that came to mind where I was like, that would be pretty cool. But yeah, your Witcher example is like you could take like any like fantasy boss monster. You could even take like Bahamut from Final Fantasy, for example, like the big dragon, and then have like Geralt fight it. Like I thought that would be really interesting, or even something like that with like crossing over the other way with like Final Fantasy and Monster Hunter and taking some of the Final Fantasy monsters, like a behemoth or something like that, and then finding them in Monster Hunter. I think would be interesting too. But
cool.
There you go. I think that's going to kind of do it for this. I know it's a little bit of a shorter show this week, friends, but it's all good. It's all good. Before we go, Garrett, plugs go.
You can follow me at Twitter at Bland Explosion, and you can follow me at Twitch if I ever stream, twitch.tv/Bland Explosion. You can listen to me over to the Nintendo Shack. I'm a co-host over there. Over at the Play Some Video Games Network, you can support them at patreon.com/PSVG. We are having a refresh, as you can tell, in the next few weeks. We're shaping around, and me and Rebecca are taking the reins of Nintendo Shack. But Donnie will be back around, and we'll have a new co-host to come in. So just keep your ear out.
It could be anyone. It could even be Garret Bland.
It could be two Garret Blands, his evil twin. Let's go.
Garrett's evil twin, Larret Bland.
With the fancy mustache and everything. Oh gosh, I just hate
so many ideas.
I hate the guy already.
As for me, you can find me on Twitter at Ryan Turford. You also find us on Twitter at the RPG Cave, as well as on YouTube, youtube.com/UnimeCapri, as well as podcast services around the globe. So for Garret Bland, I'm Ryan Turford. This has been episode 13 of the RPG Cave, and we're out.
Bye-bye.